Hello everyone and welcome to CS303 Operating Systems. So in the last class we had started discussing chapter number 2. We had laid the roadmap for chapter number 2 and discussed the learning objectives. And then we talked about how we can look at an OS from various views. One is the user view, other is the system programmer view, third is the system designer view. So today we will continue the discussion. Welcome to chapter 2, lecture 2. Now I am on slide number 2, uh, which talks about UIs or user interfaces to the operating system. So definitely we know that we need the OS to do any kind of work on the computer. So to run any application, right? To play a game, to access Twitter, to print something, to read something, any kind of task that we want to do with our computer, whether it's a desktop or laptop or a mobile phone or even a smart watch, we need to interact with the operating system. So next slides will talk about what are the different user interfaces available for us. So through the UI, we interact with the operating system to perform our computer jobs. So as such, we discussed yesterday very briefly. There are three major user interfaces, which are command line interface (CLI), graphical user interface (GUI or GUI), and third is batch interface. So batch is when you submit all your programs in one go, and then you finally get the output. So there is no interaction in between. So that batch one we won't talk about it much, but we will definitely discuss the other two: command line interface and graphical user interface. So first we talk about UI number one, command line interface or CLI, or also known as the command interpreter. So uh, you would definitely have taken GE 103, Introduction to Computing and Data Structures. So there you would have programmed in C, I suppose. And while doing your programming labs, you would have had some exposure to the Linux operating system. So within that, you probably would have used the command line for compiling and executing your C programs. I hope that was the case. So that terminal is the command line interface. Okay. So this is provided by all major operating systems. If you're running Microsoft, then you have the DOS prompt. You would be aware of that. And if you're running Linux and OS X, it would be called a terminal, right? So on my machine in Linux, it's called a terminal, and in Apple OS X, it's also called a terminal. Sometimes it may be called a shell or something, right? Something else. So as such, it is available on all operating systems. So this is also called a shell, and there are many shells to choose from: Bourne shell, Corn shell, which you can download. So you can sort of think and understand why it is called a shell. Shell is sort of like the outer covering, and then whatever is inside, when you open the shell, you can access it. So similarly, your command line interface is the outer covering, outer interface using which you can get to the OS. Yeah? Using which you can get the OS to do things for you. Okay. So what is the main function of a shell? Simple: to get and execute the next user command specified. So you can open up a shell and you can type different things. For example, you can type date, right? So if I type that, it tells me Friday, August 4, 9:38 a.m. You can type time, right? Time will give me a real, user time, system time. You can type CAL for calendar, which gives me, the calendar for current month, August 2020. So there are large number of commands to choose from, and the way you execute them, the command line interpreter waits for you to type the command. You type the command, and then it executes it and gives you back the output. What are these commands? These commands are basically programs that perform various kinds of tasks. Maybe you want to create a file, you want to delete a file, you want to do ls, which lists all the files and directories in your current directory, let's say your home directory. You may want to print a file, you may want to copy a file from one location to another, right, from one directory to another. You may want to move a file, very common operation, from one directory to another. So based on each of these tasks, we have commands. So command is nothing but a program, nothing but a piece of code. So that program runs with some arguments. So in C programming, you would have you would have looked at functions. So whenever you have a function, you specify arguments. Those arguments are used by the function and it runs. So at any point when you have a shell open, there's a system prompt, right, which could contain something. So in my case, it contains Nitin iMac, right, and then it's just the command prompt is waiting for me to type the next command. So we have a system prompt that waits for the next user command. For example, we have rm file.txt. Rm here is the name of the program that is used to delete files. On seeing this input, shell locates the code of the program named rm. So there's a specific directory where all the executables are stored, all the programs are stored. The shell looks into that once you type it in, and then loads it into memory, and then executes it with one argument, which is the name of the file. If you forget to put the name of the file, if you just put rm, so what it will tell you is missing operand or missing input, right? So if there are errors, it tells you, and then it will wait for the next command. So rm file.txt, it locates the rm program, brings it into main memory, starts executing it with the input file.txt. So the effect will be it locates file.txt. You may also provide the path, let's say /home/Nitin/desktop/file.txt. So then it knows where to look. Once it locates a file, it deletes it from the main memory, and then it will wait for the next command. Okay. Now I am on slide 3, titled CLI, command line interface or shell. So as such, the shell does not understand the command in any way. So it merely uses the command to identify a file to be loaded into memory and executed. Okay. So the programs corresponding to these files are located in the /bin directory. So if you on your Linux machine, if you do ls/bin, it will give you set of programs which are needed for the basic execution of Linux, right? So a bunch of commands like grep is there for searching, rm is there for removing file, rmdir is there for removing directory, pwd is there for password, open, so on. So less, if you have a lot of output and you want to format the output so that it's one page at a time, you can use less. Okay? So based on that, there are many commands. So it will be a nice exercise. On your Linux machine, go to the bin directory, see what kind of programs there are, and then try to search for them and find out what they do. Okay. So this is your command line interpreter or shell. Okay. So in general, your bin is a standard subdirectory, and it contains the executable files which are ready to run that must be available in order to attain minimum functionality for the purpose of running your system. So it does not contain all the programs, but it contains a subset of those programs. So you can go to bin, see what those programs are, and then after a search you can find out more about them. There's another one, echo, which just copies whatever you type in. So as I said, this is a command line interpreter, shell. You supply commands. Each command contains two parts. One is the name of the program, and other is arguments. So maybe there are no arguments, maybe there is one argument, maybe there is two arguments, so on. Depends on the program. And when you press enter after typing the command line interpreter searches for that program, loads it into memory, and then executes it with the arguments specified. Gives you back the output if it runs correctly, and then waits for the next command. If it doesn't run correctly, it gives you some error. Maybe you didn't specify the spelling correctly. Maybe you didn't specify the arguments correctly, or maybe you didn't specify the arguments at all, whereas they were required. So those kind of errors are returned back to you, and you can try again. So that's a command line interpreter. Okay. So here I am on slide 4, and this shows us a picture of the Bourne shell. So this is from Mac, Apple OS. The shell for Linux would look very similar as would for Windows. So you can see command prompt, and the root user or the system administrator is logged in, and then he or she is typing in certain commands. Right, df is a command, and then ps is a command, and so on. Okay. So df displays the amount of disk space available. Right? Amount of disk space available is displayed by df. Okay. And likewise we have ps. We can see ps is for PS displays information about a selection of active processes. Whatever processes are running, whatever programs are running, their information will be displayed by PS. So whenever you want to find out more about a command, you can use the manuals provided. So you can either do a Google search on this and saying man PS or man df. Right? So man is short form for manual. Or you can directly in the command line, you can type this command man space df. So it will give you the manual entry, and you can find out more about that program, about that command, what it is, what does it do, what are the various arguments, and so on. So very useful piece of information. Okay. So now I am on slide 5, which is graphical user interface. So before we talk about GUIs, one point about command line interpreters. There are two ways of implementing them. In option 1, the code for all the commands is a part of the code for the command line interpreter itself. Okay. So I have a huge piece of code which contains the code implementation of the command line interpreter, as well as the code implementation of all the programs in it. Okay. So generally that means command line interpreter is, the code is very the number of lines is very large, and then extending it may be a problem. In a second approach, the code of the command line interpreter is very small, just its implementation, and programs are implemented in a separate directory. Okay, so the programs are implemented in a separate directory, not as part of the command line interpreter. So this is given in the book, you can read it. Two ways in which we can implement. So now we move to graphical user interfaces. So these are definitely more common. So usually using a mouse, keyboard, monitor, or touch. So here you have icons representing files, programs, or actions, right? Various mouse actions over objects in the interface cause various actions to be performed, right? So using the mouse, you can do various actions. You can provide information, right? You can execute something, open a directory or a folder, and so on. So generally, you'll have a mouse, you'll have a keyboard, you'll have a screen on which you have certain icons, right? And then using those icons, many times you'll have options. So if you open PowerPoint, and then if you click on File, so then a drop-down menu will open where you have many options such as close, save as, share, and like that. So mixture of icons and other options, and using your mouse, whichever you select, that particular code is executed. So who invented the graphical user interface? General consensus is it was invented at Xerox PARC. So Xerox is a company. It's quite a famous one. and you can read more about them. Right, I think they're still around. Right? Xerox, American corporation selling that sells print and digital document products. So they were really into computers in the 70s. So this graphical user interface invented at Xerox PARC, Palo Alto Research Center, early 70s, and it was popularized by Apple and Microsoft in the 80s. Well, some can say perhaps it was stolen or heavily inspired from the Xerox model. Okay. So many systems now include both command line and GUI. So whether you take Linux or Windows or even Mac, they provide both options. You have graphical user interface and you have the command line interface as well. So Microsoft Windows is GUI with CLI command shell. Apple's Mac OS X is Aqua GUI interface with Unix kernel underneath and different shells or CLIs available. Unix and Linux have CLIs with optional GUI interfaces, CD, KD, Genome, and so on. Okay. So now I am on slide 6, which actually shows the Xerox graphical user interface from 1979. That's the source, and you can see that this is a lot of the concepts and GUIs are still used today. So you can see those folders are there, and then some file is open, bunch of programs are open. So this was one of the earliest graphical user interfaces. This is the one by Xerox in 1979. Okay. So what you can see is various programs open, various files, clock, and so on. Okay. Now I am on slide 7, and now you can see the graphical user interface of Apple's Lisa. So Lisa was it came out in 1983. Okay, and one of the first personal computers to present a graphical user interface. So again, you can go online and see pictures of it. It's got a small black and white monitor. It's got a keyboard. It's got certain slots for floppy drives. So you can see this is quite similar to the Xerox one, and you can see whatever elements there are on this user interface. Most of them are still used. Only difference is now we have colored desktop. So it shows various programs, widgets, preferences, waste baskets, calculator, right? A drawing application is open, right? And then some office going programs are open. So this is Apple's Lisa graphical user interface from 1983. Now I am on slide 8, and here we look at MS-DOS, right? Microsoft Disk Operating System. You can see version 1.01. This one is in color, as you can see, and it's from 1985. So disk space free in kilobytes, right? So 1, 2, and 3 about 30 MB. Memory free around 300K. So you can see memory was expensive at that time, so you didn't have a lot of it available because you still had to keep the machine cost low. So even in those times, these kind of machines were many, thousands of dollars, right? So even with this, small amounts of memory, the price was still quite high. For Apple Lisa, the price was 5,000 US dollars, right? So you can see, if you were to calculate today, in today's time, around 70 rupees for a US dollar, you can get an idea. 5,000 US dollars. Whereas these days, you can get, pretty good machine for maybe, 500 to maybe top $1,000. Okay. So this is Microsoft's version of the graphical user interface. There's a game, there's a clock, MS-DOS, command prompt, readme.doc file, right? Their Word file. So you can see more or less they all look, all the user interfaces look similar, right? So what you do is Now you're given icons, you're given options, drop down options, let's say, and then using your mouse you pick an option, and what that does is that causes the software or the code for that option to execute. So if you say edit, if you go to program, PowerPoint, right, and then if you click on about PowerPoint, it will bring up a small window which tells you, the version of PowerPoint, all the credits, who made it, and so on, right? So depending on which option you pick with your mouse, that corresponding code starts to be, starts to execute. Okay, so this is the GUI. Now I am on slide 9. So here we see Ubuntu Linux GUI. So very nice, very clean desktop. On the left you see your Firefox browser with Netflix open, Thunderbird email, right? OpenOffice application center, and then at the bottom on the left you see your terminal, right? So this is the desktop for Ubuntu Linux. So these are all examples of GUI from Xerox, from Apple, from Microsoft, from Ubuntu. So previous ones were the older GUIs. Newer ones you're already aware of. All Xerox, Spark, Apple, Lisa, MS DOS. They're all. I showed the older GUIs. New ones you can see on your machines. Ubuntu one is a slightly newer GUI, right? So this is a graphical user interface. Sort of a layer of code using which users can interact with the OS, right? So whatever actions you perform, whether typing in a command on a CLI, or whether double clicking on a particular application in a GUI, that transfers control to the OS and executes some service on the user's behalf. So double clicking on an application will bring the application from disk to main memory, and it will start executing it, right? So using the user interface, you interact with the OS and you get the OS to execute its services for you, right? Each service corresponds to some piece of code, right? Now we are on slide 10, and we have to show the user interfaces from mobile phones as well. I think number of mobile phones, at least in India, maybe a lot more than number of laptops, I'm assuming. So here we see the GUIs for mobile phones. So here by default command line is not there, and I believe for Android you can install the terminal since it's Linux based. For Apple, I think you would have to alter the OS a significant bit before you can install a terminal there, but it's still possible even for iPhone. So here generally you see this graphical user interface, and the main point in which they differ from the previous ones is that these are mostly touch enabled, right? So touchscreen devices, they require new interfaces. Mouse is not possible or not desired. Actions and selection based on certain gestures, on tap, single tap, double tap, triple tap, on swipe. So you swipe to maybe delete something, maybe you scroll, right? Physical keyboard is not there. A lot of earlier machines had a physical keyboard. I don't know if any of you have heard about BlackBerry phones. So if you if you search for certain BlackBerry phones, they used to come with a physical keyboard. And other phones also had a physical keyboard. Some by Motorola, some by other companies, some by Nokia. Right? But generally now in current times, the convention is physical keyboard is not there, and so therefore you have a virtual keyboard. So of course another way of interaction is using voice. So voice enabled interaction is becoming very popular now. So for Apple devices you have Siri, and then for Microsoft you have Cortana. So although I think now Microsoft phones are no longer being sold. When they were being sold, Cortana was there, and then for Google you have, yeah, Google is there, right? So here we see touch screen, and using touches and various gestures like tap and swipe, you interact with the OS, right? So mobile phone graphical user interfaces. Okay. So last slide on user interfaces, slide number 11. So question is which one is better? Should we use command line or should we use GUI? Well, bottom line is both are there, right? As we mentioned, in all machines that you buy, whatever OS you have, you'll have both command line interface as well as graphical user interface. So which one to use, which one is better is a personal preference, right? Advantage of GUI is it's user friendly. Even beginners, non-CS people can use it easily. Advantage of command line, it is more powerful. So generally, the thing is that if you use command line, you have access to larger number of features, larger number of OS features, right? So with a file, let's say if using GUI, you can perform 10 actions. Maybe using command line, you can perform 20. Right? So generally, this command line is preferred by users with a good knowledge of computer operations, which means system administrators, professional programmers, and you also who are CS students. User interface is typically not a part of the OS course. So there's a separate course on user interface. It's a separate area of research. The key idea there is how do users interact with computers, and what are the ways in which users interact with computers, and how can we improve the user interfaces even more, right? So we have touch, we have voice, and so on. So generally that's a separate course and not in the scope of our course. So we will not be talking much about user interfaces from now on. Okay. Okay, now I am on slide 12. And after user interfaces, we will discuss an extremely important part of operating systems, which is system calls. Okay. So what they are about. You get sort of a hint from the name itself, system call, which means calling the system, which further means calling the operating system. So you have some piece of software, you have some layer of hardware, and then you have the OS which interacts with it, which regulates it, which manages it, so that your programs can be executed. So which means from time to time, your programs will need to call the OS, right? And this is accomplished using system calls. So calling the operating system. So what are system calls? They provide an interface to the services made available by the OS. So in the earlier in this chapter, we had looked at a number of services that the OS provides. So let me go back and sort of just mention what they are. Various services provided by the operating system: program execution, I/O operations, support for file systems, communication among processes, resource allocation, talking about CPU, memory, I/O devices, accounting, error detection, protection, and security. So these are all the services which the operating system provides to the users. Okay. So these system calls, they provide an interface to the services made available by the OS. So what it simply means is that if a program, right, needs any kind of OS service, then which implies that the program needs to make one or more system calls. Okay. So these system calls are available to programmers and app developers as functions written in high-level language such as C. So we know that it's most difficult to work in binary, bit less difficult to work in assembly, and much easier to work in C. Well, people will say, as compared to C, much easier to work in Python, right? But OS is implemented in C, so we need that. So these system calls are available to programmers and app developers as functions which are written in a high-level language such as C. So programmers can write programs that use system calls. So generally, you'll have a C program, right? And then in that you can make various kinds of system calls using C functions. Okay. So OS intercepts these system calls, these C functions, and executes the relevant instructions, because ultimately whatever C code you have, it has to be converted to instructions, and those instructions are run on the CPU. So the programmer makes a system call, let's say by calling a C function. OS catches that and executes the relevant instructions. Okay. So let's motivate this discussion by looking at one particular example. Extremely common task we do all the time: a program that reads data from one file and copies it to another file. Right. So you take a file, right, and then you copy it. So you open the file, you take its data, and you copy it to another file. Backup. Okay. So this task can be split into many subtasks, as we'll see in the next slide. And each of these subtasks is actually a system call. And note that while we are doing this copy operation, there are many things that can go wrong. Right. So we have to deal with all of them. Okay. So in the next slide, let's see what sort of tasks we need to execute for doing this copy operation. Okay. So now I am on slide 13. So example of system call. So when we want to copy the contents of one file to the other. So definitely we have a source file and we have a destination file, right? Maybe they're text files, right? So this shows us a sample system call sequence. Acquire input file name. So the system needs to know which file you want to copy. Acquire input file name. Write prompt to screen. So maybe you'll get a window saying, please enter the name of input file, right? You provide that, accept input, name of the file, input file, acquire output file name. It needs to know where it has to copy, which file it has to copy. So it writes a prompt to the screen, asks you for that information, whether in a command line program or in a window in the GUI. You type that destination file, it accepts the input. You may need to specify the file path, right? Open the input file, right? It may happen input file does not exist about the program. If it does, input file exists, create output file, right? If file exists, abort, right? So if it doesn't, the output file exists. So let's say the assumption is that the output file is not there. You create it and then you copy to it. If it's there, then the assumption is you don't want to write over it, so you abort. So it depends on the program. If you want to overwrite, fine. Loop, read from input file, write to output file. So you can use some function, file read and file write function, and in a loop, till the when will you stop this copy operation. So you will stop this copy operation when you reach the end of input. Okay. So in a loop, read from input file, write to output file until read fails. So close output file, right? Write completion message to screen, terminate normally. So you can see even a simple copy operation interacts with the operating system very heavily. So each of these is a system call. So you can see even a simple action, even a simple OS service like copy, is performed, is accomplished using significant number of system calls. Okay. Now I am on slide number 14. Some examples of Linux system calls. So here we have provided a couple of websites: asm.sourceforge.net, man7.org/linux. That's a path. So you are encouraged to visit both these websites. When you visit the first one, it may take you to another website, a German website, I think. So you can visit that as well. So the idea here is to just see, what different kind of uh, what kind of system calls we have. Okay. So if I just you know, click on that, then it will tell me, list of system calls. What are some examples? Fork, like to create a new process. If you want to create a new program. Exit to end a program, right? Read for file read, write for file write, open, close for opening, closing a file, time, chmod for changing file mode bits, many more, right? So you can see the pattern. Each of these correspond to some OS service or the other, right? So in that file copy operation, this open might be used, close might be used, read would be used, write would be used, and so on. So for each OS operation, there is a system call. Okay. So how exactly the OS executes the system call, we'll soon see in a couple of slides. We'll see all the steps involved. So to get a feel of different kind of system calls, you can visit these websites. And generally, the way system calls can be arranged is with a sys in the prefix. So you may have sys underscore setup. That's one call. Sys underscore exit, another. Sys underscore fork, another. Sys underscore read, another. So generally the sys is to let us know that this is not an ordinary function. This is a specific function, a system call. Right? So note that we can have user functions also, which are not system calls. Okay. Whenever we need an OS service, whenever we need to run in the kernel mode, those kind of functions are system calls. Okay. So you are encouraged to visit all these websites. Now we are on slide 15, titled System Calls. Slide 15, System Calls. So for the benefit of application programmers, so I'm taking that as us, all of us. So we are coders, so we can code applications. So for our benefit, these system calls can be accessed using a high-level API. API is a application programming interface. Right. So rather than calling these system calls directly, we can have what we call wrapper functions. Right. So we have a wrapper function, a piece of C code, C function call, and then we add that in a program. So that is a part of the API. So those will in turn call the call the system calls, right? Invoke the system calls. So programmers call an API set of functions, high-level language like C, which in turn invoke the system calls on their behalf. So the idea is actual system calls are far more complex in their code. So programmers can be more productive if they just work with the API instead. They can get, they can create their programs and they can run them quicker if they just work with the APIs. So what are these APIs? Win32 API for Windows, POSIX API for POSIX-based machines, including virtually all versions of Unix, Linux, and Mac. So if you're using non-Windows, you'll be using the POSIX API. So POSIX stands for Portable Operating System Interface for Compatibility Between Unix-based systems. So generally, all Unix-based systems will support this POSIX API. If you happen to be on a Windows system, we will use Windows API. In general, for this particular course, we'll be focusing on the POSIX API. Okay. So OS provides a library of these functions to programmers, API functions. If you want to find out more about what these API functions are, which in turn invoke the system calls, there's a this website you can visit, gnu.org/software/libc/manual. So here you can see a list of all APIs, very detailed, right? So you have APIs for character handling. If you want to convert a character from lowercase to uppercase, there's a function for that. So they'll tell about that API. You know, for something like memory management, there are APIs for that, and so on and so forth. Sockets, arithmetic functions, and so on. So for a list of all APIs, you can visit this website. Note that system call names used throughout this text are generic. Right? Different operating systems may have different names for the same system calls. Okay. So from this slide, what we know is that as far as programmers are concerned, we don't invoke the system calls directly. We have APIs or wrapper functions, and we just include them in our programs, and those APIs will invoke the system calls on our behalf, okay, for simplicity. Okay. So now I am on slide 16. So example of a standard API, which is a read function, right? Read function that is available to Unix and Linux systems. The API is obtained from the man page by invoking command man read. So this is the description, right? It needs that header file, right? There are different, there's read is the name of the API function. Return value as size t, right? So it will have some size defined, right? Parameters need to be passed, of course. One parameter is a file descriptor. So we know that for each file, the system will assign a file descriptor, which is a sort of a handle for that, an alias for that, and all accesses to that, future accesses to that file, will be using that file descriptor. Okay, so file descriptor specifying the file to be read. BUF, a buffer where the data will be read into. So data is read into buffer. So which will be specified by BUF, a pointer to it actually, pointer to a memory location where the data will be read. Count, maximum number of bytes to be read into the buffer. So you may have that requirement. I don't want to read more than 1000 characters, let's say. So that is a count. Okay. So in your program, you will call read, and then you specify FD, let's say 4. You specify buffer, you specify the count. Okay. And then the API calls the read system call, and then it returns back, and on a successful read, number of bytes read is returned, and return value of 0 indicates end of file. If error occurs, return reads -1. Okay. So what is read? Number of bytes read is returned. So if the read fails, you have to include a value which cannot be a valid value for number of bytes. So you can read 1 byte, you can read 0 bytes, but you can never read -1 bytes, right? So that is a good value for error. So this is the API for the read system call. Okay, now I am on slide 17, system call implementation. So now we'll discuss how exactly the system calls are implemented. Okay. So some bookkeeping. Typically a number is associated with each system call, and we have a table of system calls which are indexed according to those numbers. So number is for number 1, this is a system call. For number 2, this is a system call, and so on. So this kind of data structure we have. Intended system call is invoked in OS kernel and returns status of system call and any return values. So note that for each and every one of these system calls, they will need to execute in kernel mode because they want some OS service, right? And all OS services, they execute in kernel mode. Okay. So intended system call is invoked in the OS kernel, and once the system call executes, return status of the system call, as well as any return values are conveyed back to the application that made the system call. So in case of read, number of bytes read. Okay. So nice thing about this feature is it has abstraction, which means that the caller, whether it's a user, right, or whether it's a system programmer, they do not need to know anything about how the system call is implemented. They just need to know, the programmer just needs to know which API to call, and he or she needs to call it correctly, right? So no error in the names, return type is correct, proper file descriptor name is given, all those things. Programmer needs to just obey the API and call it correctly. User just needs to, whatever action it is that results in that system call, they need to, take that action appropriately. So in short, they do not need to know, the caller does not need to know how the system call is implemented. That is abstraction. So the details of the implementation are hidden from the programmer by the API. Okay. So there's a level of abstraction. So now I am on slide 18, API system call OS relationship. So first, user application, right? So it's executing, right? Which means some programmer or bunch of programmers have coded that, and that user application is running. Its instructions are being executed. Then the application after a while makes a system call. Let's say open, right? So it goes to the system call interface, which means the API will be called open. Perhaps that would be the name of the API function. That will in turn call the appropriate open system call. So once you call the API, then the mode changes from user mode to kernel mode, and then the corresponding system call for open. So there's an index, right? As we said, a table data structure. So let's say if I is the index of that open system call, it goes there and it implements, returns back the result to the user application. So let's say once the file is open, they get a pointer to the beginning of the file, and then they can do whatever they want. Maybe start reading the file. So these are like the different layers. On the top layer, you have your user application. Once it makes the API, then you switch from user mode to the kernel mode through the system call interface, and then the kernel executes the system call on the behalf of the user and relays back the result to the user application. Okay. So this is in general the API and system call and OS relationship. Okay. So now I am on slide 19. Before we talk about slide 19, we saw that system call interface in the previous slide. So the system call interface serves as a link to system calls made available by the OS. Right? So it serves as a link to system calls made available by the OS. So system call interface intercepts function calls in the API and invokes the necessary system calls within the operating system. So it will intercept, catch the system call interface, will intercept or catch the API, and then invoke the appropriate system call. So now slide 19, system call parameter passing. So how do you pass parameters to your system calls? Right? So often more information is required than simply identifying the desired system call. For example, some parameters may need to be passed. We saw that in read. Right? So read a file named chapter2.ppt. So parameter is chapter2.ppt. Right? Of course, exact type and amount of information vary according to OS and system call. Some may need more parameters, some may need no parameters, and so on. So generally, there are three methods used to pass parameters to an OS. Simplest is we pass parameters in registers. Right? So a problem with that is register size is sort of an issue. It's limited. So for some system calls, there may be more parameters than can fit in a register. So you may need many registers, and that may become an overhead. Another option is parameters are stored in a block or table in memory, an address of that block is passed as a parameter in a register. So rather than passing the actual parameters and registers, you store all the parameters in a data structure, right, in a block or in a table, and you store that table in memory, and you pass that starting address of that table in the register. So the address is fixed, like a 32-bit maybe, and this approach will work well. So this approach is taken by Linux and Solaris. Okay. Another method, parameters may be placed or pushed onto the stack by the program and popped off the stack by the OS. So you have a stack data structure, and those parameters you push them on the stack. I hope you would have studied stack in GE 103, first in, first out. So the program pushes parameters onto the stack, and the operating system pops them off from the stack, and then uses them to make the system call. Block and stack methods do not limit the number and length of parameters. So option 2 and 3, generally you can pass as many parameters as is required. Okay. So now I am on slide 20, and this is just showing in the form of a picture, parameter passing via table, right? So X is, so one option is, option 1 is you passing parameters using a register, right? So X is parameters for the call, pass them through a register, right, by the user program, and then they are made available to the OS for executing the system call, right? That's one option. Other is store the parameters in a table, pass the address of that table in a register, and then make it available to the OS for making the system call, right? That's a system call number 13 based on that table, and based on that that appropriate system call is invoked, right? Okay, so now I am on slide 21. So we'll be wrapping up our discussion on system calls now. So these next two slides talk about the implementation or the steps involved in making a read system call. So we already know that using system calls we can get access to OS services. So typically what happens is a programmer makes a system call by calling an API, a wrapper function written in high level language, and that is called in the user space, right? And then what happens is there is a transition, what we call a kernel crossing, and we move from user space to kernel space, and then the system call, appropriate system call is called, whichever system call corresponds to that API function, and that system call is executed in kernel mode, and the results are relayed back to the caller. So then again we move from kernel to user mode, right? If there are errors, then those are also sent back. So this picture has been taken from Tannenbaum's book, and it shows the steps involved in making the read system call, since the read is what we have been talking about all along. So here we look at how the read system call executes. So you can see you have user space and kernel space, right? User mode and kernel mode, right? So we know that in kernel mode we have unrestricted access to system calls, unrestricted access to memory, whereas in user space only some instructions can be executed, and only some part of memory can be accessed. So kernel unrestricted instruction execution, unrestricted memory access, whereas for user space both are restricted. So we see the steps. We definitely start in the user space. So first, for the system call, whichever arguments are needed, in this case they are pushed onto a system stack. So we saw there are many ways of passing arguments, and here we're using one of them, which is a system stack. So for read, you can see what are the arguments we need. File descriptor that you want to, corresponding to the file that you want to read, FD is a handle for that file. Buffer into which you want to store the results, so pointer to that. And then of course the number of bytes that you want to read. So all arguments are pushed onto the stack 1, 2, 3. And then 4, what happens is we call read, which means we call the read API, the read C function. Step 4. Right now, what happens is this internally in the Linux kernel there is a table of system calls, and each system call has an index. So whatever is the index for read, that is invoked, right? And then eventually the code for that system call will run. So put code for read in register. So what is happening is that the system call number can be put in the register. Step 5. And now this API is intercepted, and then from step 5 to step 6, now we move to the kernel space, right, within the operating system. Step 6. Then the dispatcher, depending on the system call number, calls the appropriate system call handler. So it means calling the appropriate system call code which is executed. So I'll probably say maybe system call number X, whatever it is for read, right? And then it will execute the instructions for read system call. So all this execution, note that it happens in the kernel space. Once the system call code is executed, results are passed back to the caller. That's step 9. And then the stack pointer is incremented. So which means whatever the previous contents were there, these FD, buffer, and N bytes, they are erased for the next usage of the stack. And also note that when we go from step 5 to step 6, we have a trap to the kernel, where the kernel might be executing some other instructions. So we give a trap, an interrupt to it, and tell the kernel that now you need to process this read API. So this in general is all the steps. Okay. So this is the last slide for today, S22. Steps in execution of read system call. So we already discussed this from the previous slide. So this is just that discussion in form of text. API is count is equal to read FD, buffer, and bytes. So in preparation for calling read API, which calls the actual read system call, calling program first pushes all 3 parameters to stack, steps 1 to 3. Next step is call to the library procedure, step 4. System call number is put in register where the OS can read it, step 5. Next we have a trap, kernel crossing. We interrupt the kernel. We need its attention. Now we move from user to kernel mode, step 6. Kernel following trap examines system call number, which is maintained as a table data structure. And looking at system call number, it determines it's for the read system call, and it dispatches to the correct system call handler code. System call handler, so it will have the code for read system call, which is executed in kernel mode, step 8. And after execution, control is now returned to user space program, and next line of code in the program after the read function call in user mode is executed. Stack pointer is incremented to overwrite old contents. They are no longer needed. So these are all the steps in execution of a system call. So we call the API in user mode. We have a kernel crossing, go to kernel mode. Kernel executes the system call, passes back the results to the user, and now we're back in user space, and the next piece of code is executed. So I think now you should have a good idea of what system calls are and how a system call is executed. So note that system calls are used for getting access to OS services, and therefore they're always run in kernel mode. Okay, so I hope system calls are this concept is now clear. Okay.